going to call the meeting to order. Let's take roll call. Einen Lynch, here. Frazier,
Here.
Fitzsimmons, here. Gade,
Jamie's attending remotely.
Here.
Grimm,
Here.
Krieger,
Here.
Leckband,
Here.
Shetty,
Here.
Silman,
Here.
Sturdivant,
Here.
and Walter.
Here.
I have everyone this time. All right, and any staff members, can you go ahead and introduce yourselves?
Gardner?
Bissell.
Hill.
And next is approval of the minutes from May 1st, 2023. Are there any corrections or changes? If not, is there a motion to approve the minutes of May 1st,
So move.
2023?
I move. Frazier.
Shetty seconds.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? All right, the motion passes. We now have time for public comment, but seeing as there are no members of the public, I will skip over that and move on to announcements.
All right, so the first the first item is action items from that May meeting. We had two. One was to attach a cover memo to council calling out the recommendations for the potential use of ARPA funding. That memo was included in your June packet, so you would have seen it, and it was sent on to the city council prior to that. And then the second action item was that working groups would meet, and we'll have some updates on that a little later in the announcements. The next item is upcoming events, the first of which is the Diversity Market Eco Station. Megan, would you like to tell us just a little about what that is?
Yeah, so resource management with the city, climate action, Antelope Lending Library, and the Lena Project partnered together, and we have a table at the diversity market, and we're kind of lending it out to organizations for free. So we paid for it, and we're letting these organizations table at one of the days. They can provide an activity or information or whatever they would like. We're calling it Eco Station at the diversity market. The first organization was Public Space One. They had free art supplies. The second one, I believe, is Green Iowa AmeriCorps Sustainable Schools next weekend. Our last one is Transit, doing stuff about fare free, so it's a different organization every week.
The next item is Spot the Hot, which you may recall is our heat island mapping campaign. We actually are in now our data collection window as determined by NOAA. We just have to wait for several weather variables to line up in order to collect that data. The first weekend we were looking at is this most recent past weekend. The temperatures didn't quite climb high enough for us to collect that information. So now we're going to be looking at the weekend after next, July 21st, 22nd, and 23rd. At the very least, you can all cross your fingers that those data variables align. One of the potential hurdles we've run into is actually the wildfire haze from the Canadian wildfires, which we're expected to experience again this summer periodically, and we aren't able to collect data if that blows in. So cross your fingers for high heat, no haze, low humidity, and high pressure, I think are the variables we're looking at. And if anybody would like to serve as a volunteer, we are still signing up volunteers because we know that we won't know until a few days ahead of time when the event is going to take place, and people's schedules change all the time. So anyone who would like to serve as a backup, even as a volunteer, that would be very valuable to us and could be quite fun. And we can hook you up with the training materials and such if you are interested in that opportunity.
Since that falls over the start of the county fair, where I will be at for many hours, I will not hope for high temperature. Sorry.
All right, Matt.
Maybe after that.
The next event is coming up in August. That's Farm to Street, and that's just on here largely to let you know we are once again a major sponsor for that event, which of course is a fundraiser in support of local foods initiatives. This year's recipient of the fundraiser is going to be the Global Food Project, which we're quite excited about. And we also, in addition to the financial support we provide for that event, we also provide staffing to help get it set up. So if you want to cross your fingers for a not hot day and be sanctioned in doing so, you can hope on our behalf we're not sweating it out setting up those tables that day. And then just something to have on your long-range calendar, we're lining up activities for Climate Fest, and there is a small typo here. Climate Fest is going to take place from September 18th through the 23rd, so that's a full week of events. Megan's been hard at work lining up some really exciting offerings, including a celebration of our fare-free transit. We're trying some old popular things, some new things, and one of the biggest new things we're doing this year is we're going to send out a community-wide mailer. So you may be familiar with periodically getting a mailer from the library talking about upcoming programming. This is our effort to both better advertise Climate Fest and also just highlight some of the successes throughout the year so that whether or not someone attends, they understand what there is to celebrate in Iowa City in terms of climate action. So we're quite excited about that. Are there any questions about any of the upcoming events before we move on? All right. And then next up, of course, we have the working group updates. Would someone from the Energy Benchmarking Working Group like to provide an update of where we're at in those discussions? Or perhaps Danny can. I know it's been a little while since we've met.
Yeah, at the last meeting, we discussed potential hybrid options where we can bring businesses and building owners on board on a voluntary basis and helping them to input their data into Portfolio Manager.
I'll just add that we've had some early success reaching out to a couple entities that are willing to pilot the efforts with us. In fact, we were just talking with a church downtown in the last several weeks that said they'd be interested in serving as a church example for working on that. And so we're looking at incentives that we can tie to those efforts as well to help bring people on board with benchmarking. John.
We also discussed, and not for the first time, and from my perspective, not the last time, the need to be able to monetize the value to the participants in these activities, because some will do it out of the goodness of their heart, but most will wait until there's a positive cash flow reason for them to be involved. And so anyone that any time has any ideas about this monetization, it's I think it's critical, and not only this, but all we do.
How about the marketing audience mapping? Megan, you want to give a little overview, and anyone else in the group can jump in?
So we met, it's been a while, I believe it was the first week in June. It was just an intro. We brainstorm audience mapping for Fare Free Iowa City. It kind of transitioned from the Goldie campaigns to Fare Free Iowa City, since that is a big undertaking. We brainstorm different audiences. Everyone had kind of an assignment, and we're meeting tomorrow to discuss the audiences that we selected and what we came up with, and then we'll probably meet at least one more time after that.
I'll just add that from a staff perspective, it was really valuable to us to have that group ready to go when we got the Fare Free approval, because that will be going into effect August 1st. So we have to move pretty quickly to develop a marketing campaign, at least for the initial rollout. And then the marketing group is also thinking long-term about some groups that we can engage. So that's been really valuable, and actually some of those that initial discussion has informed staff discussions on marketing the rollout, so that's been really helpful. Anything else? All right. So concludes announcements.
Shall we move on to unfinished and ongoing business?
All right, the first item on this list is the Root for Trees recap, and I'm going to turn this over to Danny to talk about since he's been administering that program this year.
So as you saw in your packet, the third year of the Root for Trees program wrapped up in May. We saw an increase over last year. We had a total of 376 vouchers. 24 of those vouchers were given to folks living in our Justice 40 census tracts. If you saw that map in your packet, we've started tracking all of our programs alongside the Justice 40 tracts as a simpler way to look at our efforts in underserved areas, and because federal grants are tied to Justice 40 now. So any questions on the Root for Trees program?
I just want to say congratulations. It's a great program. I have used it and love it. But I was wondering if there ever has been or could be programs to help citizens in Iowa City take down dead trees.
We have heard that a lot. We did investigate that this year, especially with many folks having ash trees affected by the emerald ash borer. The cost is variable and high, so we didn't find it within our budget. However, Neighborhood and Development Services does have a program that they administer to help people bring diseased trees or nuisance trees down.
Great, thank
And
you.
that's for income qualified households.
Okay, thanks.
This is Zion Lynch. I'm also curious if we've ever thought of similar programs for native plantings or buffalo grass or some of those, helping people switch to the kinds of lawns that will have deep roots and pull in water.
It's kind of a, I would characterize it more as a pilot program now, but one of our AmeriCorps members is helping some Iowa City residents transition at least a portion of their lawn from turf grass to more native prairie plantings.
Or just to follow up on that, are they doing any additional sort of like data review of that, just to see how it impacts? I guess what's the goal of that particular program?
Considering it's an AmeriCorps project, ongoing data collection might not be possible once that AmeriCorps member leaves, but we could investigate a way using leave behinds or something to track that going forward.
Is there specific data you have in mind, Matt?
Well, I'm wondering if Michael has the same thought, but the benefit would be an adaptation, right, with water management, with reduced toxicity, those types of things. And so I didn't know if there was something related there to that. Because the Root for Trees program is about canopy, heat island effect, those types of issues, but prairie plantings kind of approach adaptation a little bit differently than canopy trees. So I just wondered.
I can just add, it's a project for AmeriCorps, kind of his project. Every single AmeriCorps member has to have their own project. He does, I know he has a spreadsheet of all the addresses and the plants that they planted and how large of a plot. So we have that information. Beyond that, not sure if the next team will want to carry that over or not, but we do have at least that data.
And my questions are just stemming from, it's cool to see how successful the Root for Trees program is becoming, and so that just made me start thinking of other similar types of programs that we might implement. So thank you for the update.
Before we move on, one thing we did want to point out in the memo was the inclusion of that map showing Justice 40 tracts. I know that Justice 40 is not a concept maybe that's familiar to everyone, so we did want to offer just a little explanation while we're tracking that. As you heard Danny mention, federal grants related to climate are tied with Justice 40 requirements, part of which the overarching framework of that is the idea that 40% of benefits from this type of funding should flow to vulnerable or under-resourced communities. And there are specifically designated census tracts that the federal government has established. We have 2 of them here in Iowa City. And so basically, this is an effort to align the criteria that we are using to look at equity with the criteria being used by these federal funding opportunities, so that we can keep our eye out on upcoming funding opportunities and already have some data in the bank, if we need to demonstrate our efforts on this front to make a stronger case, for example, for getting grant funding, or to be able just to demonstrate that we're familiar with this concept and thinking about it in our own programming. So hopefully that's a helpful explanation. Great. All right, so next up then we have the Resilience Hub pilot proposal. I want to start with a big thank you to our Resilience Hub working group, which met, I know we had originally hoped to meet for 3 months. It went a little longer than that. We had a number of really productive conversations. We looked at some great resources that working group members brought in, and of course we had ongoing discussions with the potential recipient neighborhood centers of Johnson County, to talk about, from a nonprofit perspective, what might serve their needs, all of which led to the memo that was included in your packet outlining the proposed program. I will say we shared this memo with neighborhood centers for our neighborhood centers of Johnson County as well to get their feedback and ask, if this aligned roughly with their sense of the conversations as well, just to make sure we're accurately capturing that. And we received very positive feedback, very enthusiastic. In particular, they liked the flexibility that it incorporated both a planning and an implementation phase. And I will say this was perhaps the other benefit of that working group going a little longer than expected. During that time, the federal government released its guidance for the climate pollution reduction grants, and that also included a planning and an implementation phase, so we were able to take that idea and apply it here. But ultimately, what that really does is allow us, instead of us coming in and saying, we know what's best for your organization and for resilience, it allows it to be much more of an effective partnership. For those of you who are familiar with Arnstein's ladder of engagement, it moves it significantly higher on the ladder, so that's exciting. But of course, we want to bring it to the group as a whole before we roll it out and get any additional feedback. So yeah, I would like to open the floor and take any comments you'd like to share.
I guess one of my questions was, so there's a 1 year, the first year is the planning year. Is the intended that for the following 2 years that the implementation happens, like the dollars are provided each year for the same program, or that it's provided one of those 2 years?
The idea, I think, is that we would provide $10,000 or up to $10,000 during year 1 for planning activity, and then year 2 and year 3 would both get $50,000. So it's essentially a $110,000 program. And part of the reason we wanted to do that, especially in our discussions with the group, was to make it a meaningful amount of money, something that if you wanted to do solar panels, you could really have a big chunk of change to work with, so that one of the things we've seen and learned, I think, from our climate action grants is, we often get grants. Those are capped at $10,000. We get those grant requests, and that can buy a handful of panels, but the nonprofits that have applied for them have then engaged in other fundraising. And that would still be an option for anybody participating in the Resilience Hub. But this just makes it, I think, a little more in reach to get the size of panels panels they might need, or if they wanted a geothermal system or batteries, or, some project that we haven't been able to imagine, but they have in mind. It's not just a token amount of money. It's real funding that can be sustained over the course of multiple years. Well, 2 years.
So then the splitting of the funding over 2 implementation years is a way to help manage the cost from the city's perspective as well. Is that
Yes.
the thought? Okay.
It's a little to help manage the cost, and it's also a little to help if they go down one path and they'd like to do 2 different projects, they're not roped
Okay.
into just one.
Sure, yeah.
Yeah.
My question was along the same lines. I was a little confused about whether there was one approval for the total amount of money, or if we had to renew after year 1 or 2 or 3 and find out that we weren't approved for the second year or the third year, it would really interrupt the momentum in our planning. But once we're approved, it's a done deal for the whole amount for the whole 3 years?
Yes, and it's not a blank check. The intention is that climate action staff would continue to be involved. We would be assisting with the planning process, and we'd be providing regular updates on the projects to these commission so that there's accountability in it as well. But part of being able to plan, and we know this from just planning city programs, is you want to be able to count on that money, right? So that you can plan ahead and not get halfway down the road of a project and suddenly realize you don't have the funding for it.
My concern from the very beginning, and a positive concern, was to invest in something that if it went well, we could continue to ride it, promote it, and grow it. And that's why I'm excited about this, because this sounds like something that's worthy of building year after year, to the point that it's a much larger program by the time all of us are done with it. Do you see that follow-up possibility after 3 years?
Of continuing to fund the same organization or to grow with other organizations?
Well, the whole Resilience Hub theory of continuing that. Now, to use an example, and I apologize, I don't want to bring up bicycles, but we could buy more and more bicycles if the bicycle project worked. But I see a lot more potential for increasing the number of resilience hubs or the size of the resilience hubs so that we triple and quadruple those efforts longer term with more funding. And now we can do that because we built a solid foundation the first couple of years. That's why I love this program.
Oh. Well, that's great. I'm glad that you're feeling positively about it as well. I mean, yes, our intention is not to establish one resilience hub and be like, check that box. The idea is that it's also a learning and growing opportunity for us as we feel our way through it, and that would be, of course, the other reason for the climate action staff to stay involved with this initial pilot effort, with the hopes that we can learn from rolling it out with this first agency and then grow it and offer it to other agencies. And you'll see even in the success metrics for the third year, I believe we wrote something in there about other organizations would be contacting us, or we would be identifying other organizations that we could partner with to serve as additional resilience hubs.
Can you, oh, sorry, go ahead.
This is Michelle Silman, and one of the things under the success benchmarks in year 1 that I saw was the home resilience kit starter packs. And I'm sure you probably don't know exactly what those would be, but I was just wondering, did you envision that as being the, the items that under emergency supplies, or what sort of thing would that be?
This is actually an outgrowth from the Climate Resilience Corps efforts that we did, which was our first baby step toward establishing resilience hubs. And part of that process was that the Climate Resilience Corps members, as you might remember, went out and talked to neighbors and then came back and used those conversations to identify what would go in the kits. So roughly, yes, there are some emergency supplies, and certainly we would be beginning the conversation by talking about here's what we've seen in these kits that have been previously delivered to households, but there's some flexibility there, too, for the Resilience Hub to say, well, in our neighborhood or with our clients, what we're seeing the needs are is maybe maybe, well, everybody's all excited from those kits, I would say, about the solar-powered cell phone chargers, right? So I don't imagine they're going away, but maybe they'll say, in our neighborhood, we don't need storage containers for water as much as we need can openers or flashlights or what have you. And so the kits, I think, will grow out of those conversations the same way they did for the Climate Resilience Corps.
So do the kits go to homes then, or are they at the Resilience Hub, or how does it work?
It could be both. It could, depending on the direction they want to go, and certainly when we did it with the Climate Resilience Corps, there was a door-to-door effort to drop off these kits, sort of like a mini blitz, similar to our energy blitz. It could be that the organization says, we want to deliver them in the same way. The participants in our Climate Resilience Corps are going to deliver them to their neighbors, but we also want to have additional kits here at the center or at our nonprofit to hand out as people need them, and we'll work with them on that.
Just from having been in a variety of different like emergency type situations, like Cedar Rapids during derecho, and Des Moines when there was the flood and we had no water, having the stuff available at the time of the emergency is, and then Cedar Rapids for the flood too. It's just like, that's when, it's like, to me, that seems like that's when it's really important to have that, when everybody's in crisis mode, to have some stuff available at that time. Just seems to me like that makes the most sense.
Thank you. We appreciate that feedback.
Sarah, can you remind us, I know we won't know for a while, but I'm wondering when we will know about the ARPA funding from the last meeting, when we said one of our recommendations would be spending that money on the Resilience Hub program. Do we have any sense of when we might know?
Well, as a
Can I cut in here quick, with the question that was just asked? I was wondering if the Justice 40, does that cover? It kind of ties into that question too. That was my question, if the Justice 40 initiative covers any of that, because it's one of those that seems really open funding wise.
Could you clarify the question, Gabe? Are you asking if the household served will be in a Justice 40 track, or if Justice 40 will fund the program?
Like, kind of, yeah. Is the Justice 40 funding, are there descriptions as to what it will and won't cover?
All right. Well, okay.
Or
Thank
is
you
the
for
ARPA
clarifying.
completely covering it?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, my audio keeps cutting in and out, so it might cut out, so.
Well, just to be clear, there is no specific funding tied to Justice 40 initiatives. Justice 40 is an equity measure that's being used in other federal funding projects. So we wouldn't necessarily expect funding from that, though there may be federal funding that we could tap into and would need to report on the Justice 40 connections to it. But I think a project like this, sorry, we had the lights go dim. I think a project like this, aimed at serving vulnerable populations, certainly would be an excellent candidate for anything that has a Justice 40 component tied to it as a funding opportunity, if that makes sense. Yeah, all right. In response to the ARPA question, just as a reminder, we don't necessarily expect to get ARPA funding. There are other projects that are already in the pipeline that will likely receive that funding and use up the remaining ARPA dollars first. The City Council asked us to consider that question as kind of a gut check, and of course it's helpful for staff too to know where our funding priorities are. So that's a long-winded way of saying we don't know when we'll find out. It depends on those other programs when they reach their coterminous and have all the funding they need. But we have designed this program to not count on that funding. But we'd love it if we got it. Anything else?
I can't remember if it was in here. Was there a goal number of CBOs?
Well, for the pilot, we'll just work with
Just one, okay.
to feel our way through, and then we'll grow it from there.
Okay.
But I will say one of the nice things is of course, we've been in conversation with NCJC about this and anticipate them signing on for the pilot program. And they have 2 locations currently and have a 3rd in the planning. So this actually comes at a really great time for them as well, because as they're thinking about that new facility, it's a chance to think about building resilience measures and programming into it. And just by virtue of working with this one organization, we'll have coverage in 3 different areas of the town. So it's a 3-for-1 deal in some ways. And they've just been
Hey,
great.
Sarah, you said NCJC, right?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you.
And they've been really great and generous with their feedback and their thoughts on this program. So that's been very helpful without knowing how much money we were going to attach to it, I should say that. All right, seeing no further comments, I think it probably would be helpful for the record just to take a vote to approve to move forward on this. Would anybody like to move to do so?
I move to go forward with the vote. Michelle Solman.
Krieger seconds.
Mike Mann, second.
Third.
So was that a move to vote or a move to
Approve
move forward with the
$10,000.
pilot?
What do we need?
Move forward.
I move to move forward with the pilot.
Do we still have your second, Jesse?
Yes, Mike Mann, second.
Great. All in favor of moving forward with the Resilience Hub pilot proposal?
Aye.
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 Aye. Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the motion passes.
Great, thank you all for your support for this exciting program. We'll be looking forward to bringing you updates as it rolls out.
And updates on the adaptation plan, climate action and adaptation plan?
We are past due on this one. Our intention is to provide these quarterly, and we've had to push them back because of our full agendas, which is a good thing to be so busy. But this is now covering 6 months of climate action activity, which is quite a lot, so we know it's a little lengthier than you've seen before. Just as we did with the last time we looked at this, what I'd like to do is just give everybody a few minutes to read through the summary document, and then if you have any questions about any specific ones, if you would call them out, we'd be happy to go into more detail about any of them.
So I was wondering about the enhanced energy standards for city rehabilitation projects. It's something that I just don't know a lot about.
It's a great question. Thanks, Michelle. So The city receives funding to update building stock here. Lately, it's focused on our South District neighborhood program, where the city purchases properties, rehabilitates them, and then puts them back on the market. We have been adding climate dollars to the federal dollars that support that funding, and as a result, we've been able to add several climate interventions to the homes. There were two in particular, and this refers to the second of the two properties that we updated a few years ago. A couple years ago. So we did things like put in heat pumps, high energy efficiency windows and doors. We added solar panels on the roofs of both of these projects. They were also then used in the Women's Confidence course through Kirkwood, so that there were some building skills that were taught through the rehabbing efforts, and we put in some climate-friendly native landscaping on the outside of the buildings. The first one sold late last year. The second one was finally completed and ready to be put on the market earlier this year, and it has now sold as well. And we're told there are two very happy families living in both of those, enjoying the solar energy and the low energy bills from all the equipment that was put in. So a great program.
Yeah, actually, I had a follow-up question on that. Remind me, I think there was this, it wasn't, I think, part of the program to start with, but we're not doing sort of a pre-analysis, post-analysis on energy use, correct?
Correct. It's a little tricky for those two properties because we came in at part of the reason we acquired them is one of them had been gutted by a fire. And so the residents were already living out of it, and we didn't have data to compare. But there are several other properties in this program, and we have sent our AmeriCorps team in for each of them to gather the data ahead of the rehabilitation efforts. So for the remaining projects, we will be able to have pre and post data to look at, just in terms of the energy exchanges in the building and what have you. And we'll be able to request utility data before and after for those if we so choose. So that'll be great too. Since we're the owners of those properties now, it's easier to get that information. Are you overwhelmed by 6 months of work?
Great.
It's always satisfying, I will say, to me when I type up this list to see it get a little longer each time.
Remind me, what is the term again for the Green Arrow AmeriCorps group? What does it run on the calendar year? I can't remember.
So they start at the end of September, and then in the middle of August is when they end.
Okay.
It kind of fluctuates like a week here and there, but our team will be done August 31st this year.
The energy audits actually can't be done in the final 6 weeks or so of their terms usually, because you need a big enough temperature differential between the exterior of the house and the interior to be able to get accurate readings. So the high temperatures, which will again be great for our heat island mapping efforts, will make it difficult for AmeriCorps to conduct audits.
And this was the first full year that they were back in doing the audits, is that right?
No, they only quit for a few months during COVID.
Okay, all right.
Because my last term with AmeriCorps was actually in 2020, 2021, and we did audits. There were just, whenever it spiked really high, we didn't go on them for a while.
It's not included in this update, in part because this was pulled together for June, and we just got this update last week. But we've been in discussion with the county about collaborating next year to bring on an additional member to the team so that we can provide these audit services throughout the county and not just in Iowa City alone. Our thinking behind this, there are several things that led up to this discussion, one of which is that we always receive requests for folks living in the outlying area around Iowa City, and also we often get requests from University Heights residents to come and perform energy audits, and we aren't able to do that as long as it's just Iowa City tax dollars supporting the team. But because the county has agreed to contribute money to help support the team next year, that will allow us to send it out to all the county residents, which is great. It's tapping into our experience as a well-established Green Iowa AmeriCorps program. In fact, in this last year, we found out that we performed like the predominant number of energy audits in the state by a pretty wide margin.
Like almost all of them.
So we've got a very mature program. We've got a way of advertising it to residents that clearly works. And this is an ability for the county, instead of having to reinvent the wheel, to just provide some material support and tap into those successes. And of course, as we know, and as we always discuss, like if Iowa City did everything right, but we were just a perfect little climate bubble, that does not matter to climate change. We will still feel the effects of climate impacts regardless. So to be able to get the word out about energy efficiency and help provide these services for our neighbors is just a great effort that ultimately serves Iowa City's goals as well. And as we'll soon be discussing, with our acceptance of the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant funds, we're going to be undertaking a regional climate action plan. And so this is just a great step in collaborating in that direction. So a lot of nice momentum here.
And what was do we know the stats yet for number of audits this year compared to like pre-COVID? You know, have they been up?
So our AmeriCorps team has actually outdone all previous AmeriCorps teams so
Okay.
far. Everyone has hit about 100, even with COVID. This one, it's 130-ish right now, and they still have some on the calendar.
Okay, great.
Part of
Congrats.
that's because, we're paying to have all our members BPI certified, whereas other teams only get 2 members able to do that. So we're able to send out teams pretty regularly, which is great. And it's great for them. It's a great green jobs building credential. Does it make you want to cry to know that most of the audits in the state were performed here, and it's 130 audits?
Which is why a regional approach to climate action sounds like a great idea too.
Thanks, Matt.
This is Sturtevant. Is there a specific reason for that? Is it just, since Ames is smaller, or, not that it matters, but are we just that far ahead of everything else? Or is there a reason that it's not done in other cities as much?
So good question. Not all cities have an AmeriCorps team. That's part of it. There's only a few teams hosted that do audits throughout Iowa. Unfortunately, 0 in Northwest Iowa at the moment. They are trying to get up there. So that's part of it. Another part is, like Sarah said, not all of them are BPI certified. And then a really big part is actually we had a full team of 4 members, and all of the other teams did not. So that's another part. And that they're trying to look into figuring out why they can't recruit more AmeriCorps members. Long story short, staffing is probably the biggest reason.
Yes, John.
And
That makes a lot of sense, because I was actually looking at AmeriCorps when I was in school, and I wondered why there were so many openings up in northwestern Iowa. I never associated like they don't have anybody up there with, yeah. So thank you.
I would politely, maybe inappropriately, but politely suggest that part of it's because we're in Johnson County, which is a different state than western Iowa politically. And we have that challenge ahead of us, too, and that's something we can't stop thinking about, and it's easy to stop thinking about it because it seems to be an unsurmountable barrier, and it will be unsurmountable as long as we don't make an effort to appropriately, properly, politely continue our educational efforts outside of our own region. And we need to do that. We'd find in other states that there are more communities involved than there are in Iowa. And part of the reason is, unfortunately, politics and climate denial.
I was looking back at the overall summary, BI 6, which is the building permit fee rebate. Was that the update you were, because there was a summer 2023 launch target. Is that the homebuilders, the HBA program?
Yes, we are coordinating with the HBA on that one. This relates, this is an initiative that we haven't been able to roll out successfully up till now. We've been having a lot of discussions leading up to it, trying to figure out where the pinch points were in the past, where we're out. This is another one that we've recently had some success in moving forward. The first is noted in here that we figured out to tie it to the HERS rating. This actually goes back to the Realtor engagement event we sponsored earlier this year, which I think put HERS ratings on a lot more radars than they had been before. What a HERS rating does is allows us to get some outside verification of the kinds of building interventions we're looking for, which is, just to be perfectly frank, beyond the expertise of our climate action staff, right? So there's somebody with expertise that we can tap into that can provide that verification for us. And there's interest in it now because a lot of area realtors and some of whom are builders, or many of whom are tied to builders, have heard about it and are thinking about how to market it to their clients. What we'd like to do, the other thing we realized in these discussions is that a building permit fee rebate is actually very difficult to initiate because those rebates are complex in how they're calculated for each building project, and those permit fees actually pay the staff wages of the people who are administering them. So if you rebate it, you need a way to backfill it in order to continue to have staff who are reviewing those permit applications regardless, right? So one of the ways we figured out to move forward on this is, and you'll see this when we bring the fully formed proposal forward, is we're just going to eliminate the permit fee rebate language entirely and call it an energy efficiency award, because we'll be offering it essentially as a grant to anybody who builds to this higher standard and gets a HERS rating. We've tied it to a HERS rating of 55 or better, based on programs we've seen in other cities and our research on it. We also realized in our conversations with the HBA that if we called it a building permit rebate fee, that triggers a lot of negative associations, one, and there was a concern that because there's a fee you have to pay to get the HERS rating, that we're asking people to try to get a HERS rating regardless of whether or not they're going to get this fee back to them, right? And so there would be some reluctance in participating, whereas if we call it an award, it sort of sidesteps that whole conversation and gets us to where we want to be, which is providing incentives to build to a higher energy code standard. In addition to outlining this program, in our conversations with HBA, we talked about ways we could partner on the Parade of Homes next year more effectively. And one of the proposals they had, which we were just very enthusiastic about, was asking every entry into the Parade of Homes to get a HERS rating as a way to showcase that particular standard, and then providing an award at the HBA banquet to the home that achieves the lowest HERS score. HERS, it turns out, is like golf. The lower the score, the better.
Yep.
So that's another way of sort of promoting this project and recognizing someone and creating a kind of fun competitive element to it, which I know we've talked about before. How do we tap into competitive programs effectively? So I think this one's been a long time in development, but all of those conversations, again, are paying off. We've really built some nice connections in the community that I think are going to help make it a successful program, and we'll be excited to be rolling it out here in the next, hopefully by the end of the year. Yeah.
Great, thank you.
That's a great example. I'll just say, sometimes these programs feel impossible until suddenly they're not. And then it's like, not only is it not impossible, amazing things you never dreamed of are available. So that's great.
Which is why collaboration with community partners and getting that feedback's critical, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it shows how like one program a success in one area can lead to another. Like had we not initiated those realtor conversations, we would not be here discussing this form of the program today. So it's just, it's great all around. It's nice to see work continue to scaffold like that.
I was wondering
This
if,
is Sturtevant. I agree. I talked to a few real estate friends, and they went through that program, and they said it was way more informative than what they had expected. They had expected something kind of less than what was presented, but they said it was amazing to go through the process.
this is Selman, and I was wondering about the scaling of the current mattress recycling pilot program to serve all residents. I'm not familiar with the mattress recycling pilot program, and so I was just wondering, what that's about and what the scaling is, how that will work.
Actually, this is a great question to keep in mind for next month when Jane Welch, our recycling coordinator, will be joining us, because she can speak to it in a lot more detail. She's actually been the mastermind behind designing that program. Mattresses are difficult items for us to landfill for a variety of reasons. Part of effective landfill engineering is being able to compact everything that goes in it. If you try to imagine a backhoe compacting a mattress, Matt is right to laugh. They're difficult on a number of levels, and there are valuable materials in mattresses. Specifically, the steel springs have a high recycle potential. The difficulty, of course, is that mattresses come in all different shapes and sizes. You're increasingly seeing programs that used to pick up, not here, but in other communities, mattresses no longer doing so out of concern for bed bugs, for example. So there's a lot of thought that had to go into this program design. But essentially, under this program, as I understand it, we've partnered with an organization in Cedar Rapids. We actually had wanted to get this program up and running, and then the derecho took the roof off of the organization, which set it back as they repaired. But they are now able to take the mattresses on. They have trained their staff to deconstruct the mattresses and separate out the material that can be recycled from the material that can't. And based on that sort of learning curve, which, as I understand it, in early days, the goal is eventually to scale it up so that all the mattresses we collect would be sent to it. But Jane would have far more detail on it. Let's all make a note to ourselves to bring it up when she comes next month.
This is Einan Lynch. I had a question. This wasn't in the summary, but in the whole plan, the local procurement item, I just noticed there were some things sort of projecting out to 2024, and I didn't write down exactly what it said, but I was just curious to hear an update on that item and the I know Beyond Plastics has been a challenge, and maybe this is also one to hold for Jane. I'm curious how those projects are going and how you're seeing that move into 2024.
Megan, would you like to provide a few updates on this? I know you've been doing some of the research as we try to find, this is another one where, I think we're looking at some avenues, and when we reach a roadblock, we try to look at alternatives, and Megan will be able to give us the best update.
Yeah, not a huge update. I have just reached out to some people just to review their policies. So like Becky Soglin sent me the county's file. We are tapped into USDN's network, and there was actually a question very similar about procurement in regards to city departments purchasing. And so there were some documents and some resources on there. So I've just been gathering some resources. That's all I have at the moment. It kind of got pushed to a back burner when Spot the Hot, we won the grant. So that's all I have.
Any other questions?
Not really a question. I just want to say congrats to the city for, on the transportation side, the switching to the free fares and the grants that are coming through for the electric buses. That's just great news all around, and I'm very proud of what the city is doing. So thank you.
Shall we move on to new business?
Well, speaking of exciting news, for us at least, some of you may have been following along with the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant opportunity. This is a pot of money that was developed under the Inflation Reduction Act. And just to give you a little background on it, initially the funding was offered to all 50 states and the 64 largest metropolitan statistical areas in the U.S. So 50 states and 64 biggest cities, essentially, plus their outlying areas. 46 states accepted the funding. We happened to be in a state that did not. When that happened in March, when the state officially turned down the funding, the $3 million that was originally allocated to Iowa to develop a statewide climate action plan was divided into 3 smaller pots of $1 million each, and those were offered to the 3 largest MSAs in Iowa. We are not one of the largest MSAs. We're a larger one. But when we saw this happening, in part because we had already been collaborating with Cedar Rapids on Spot the Hot and had been looking at other ways we could collaborate, we said, wouldn't it be great if we could work together to develop a regional climate action plan? And so we came up with a plan to do exactly that, knowing that Cedar Rapids was in line to receive the $1 million. When another entity in the state turned down their $1 million pot, that money then flowed to Iowa City. So now Iowa City has $1 million and Cedar Rapids has $1 million for their MSAs, which in this case for Iowa City includes all the communities within Johnson County and Washington County. And in Cedar Rapids, it includes Lynn County, oh, I'm going to get their list wrong. I'm such a terrible partner in this respect. Lynn County and some adjacent counties. But basically, the corridor area, our entire commute shed will be covered by this. And this is just fantastic news on a couple levels. One, as we've discussed, these regional collaborations are so key in developing effective climate actions, right? If we look at that commute shed, there's more heavy industry in Cedar Rapids than there is in Iowa City. In Iowa City, we have more knowledge workers who are commuting longer distances to come to us, and so coming up with a plan that addresses all of these things will just help us all be more effective in what we want to do. In addition, and this is the part that's really critical, $1 million in some ways is a lot of money and in other ways isn't, compared to the many billions of dollars available under the entire climate pollution reduction grant program. In order to access those other dollars, you have to have developed 2 specific plans using a planning grant. And so by virtue of getting these planning dollars, we will be able to develop those 2 plans, which will then make us eligible for federal funding for continued projects. So things that we've looked at in the past, just as an example, the methane capture feasibility study we did a couple years ago, where we determined it wasn't financially viable for Iowa City under its own steam. Should we choose to include it in our priority climate action plan, it will then be eligible to apply for competitive grants under the Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program, which I swear to you, I wish had a shorter or easier to say name. But CPRG, basically, this is an opportunity for us to pull projects like that out of our existing plan, put it into a priority plan, and then hoist the flag to the federal government and say, send us your dollars. We've got ways to use them. We have thought this through. So where we are at in this process now is we put up our hand. We said we would like to take the money. We are partnering with ECOG, which is a council of governments that serves both the Cedar Rapids and Iowa City area, to serve as the lead entity that will receive the dollars. And what this essentially means is it's really that they are going to meet the federal accounting requirements, so it takes some of the burden off of our staff to have to do that work. They're also going to help us contract for a contractor to come in and help with some of the technical aspects that are required under this program. Up till now, as you know, we've been maintaining a greenhouse gas emissions inventory. The Climate Pollution Reduction Grant Program requires that you also account for carbon sinks in the community, so we'd like to bring in some technical expertise to help with that. There's also a green jobs development component for the second plan that we'll have to develop under it, and so we'd like to tap into some expertise there. That's not something that we've done a lot with in the past. So very exciting stuff. We've been working very closely with ECOG and the other entities involved, Johnson County and Lynn County and Cedar Rapids, to send off a proposed budget to the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which is administering this particular program. We just got word at the end of last week that they have sent back some comments on our work plan and our budget, which by and large looks like they're going to accept it. They're just asking for us to tablize some things and make some minor tweaks just to make it easier for them to account and review. And then we'll be given the green light to begin our planning activities. So that's super exciting. And it means work for you. The first step in this project is to develop what they're calling the Priority Climate Action Plan, and that is basically a review of existing climate action plans for the area that identifies projects that would benefit from federal funding. So as a first step, I and the Cedar Rapids sustainability manager are going to sit down with our existing plans and pull out the items that we think should go into this priority climate action plan. In addition, Lynn County and Johnson County, even though they don't have formal climate action plans of their own, they do have some internal documents that guide some of their sustainability and climate activities. They're going to go through those documents and contribute items as well. And then we're going to share them out with the the larger metropolitan statistical area to say, what of these things would make sense for your community? What would you like to include as well? And in particular, what we really want to have an eye toward are projects that we can collaborate on. Since Iowa doesn't have a statewide plan and is a bit of an outlier in that way, we want to have an eye toward things that other communities might be able to participate in, similar to our EV readiness plan, where we were able to work with other communities. Even if they aren't included necessarily in the planning area, they may still be able to participate in an effort for which we could secure funding, which would be exciting. When we perform this desktop review, are going to come to you as the Climate Action Commission and ask you to review it as well to make sure that we are picking up on the things that we think truly do belong in the plan. And also, some things may need clarification, right? One of the things we found as we've worked our way through the Climate Action Plan is it has items that, like, let's just take the very first one that says promote energy efficiency and performance tips to the public, right? That kind of engagement may not necessarily benefit from federal dollars, but if we wanted to say, be more specific and say, develop a heat pump rebate program for participating communities, that's something we could go after federal dollars for. And so we might ask you to help us drill down a little and think through the specifics of what goes in. And this is sort of, in some ways, we've been primed by our ARPA discussion to dream big, knowing that we're not going to get funding for everything, but we won't get funding for anything that doesn't go in. So we want to, like, cast a wide and specific net, which sometimes is at odds with each other, but we're going to work through it. So we'll be working with you over the course of the next year. That priority climate action plan is due to the EPA roughly by April of next year, so we've got to move very quickly on it, which is where we're so grateful for all the work that's come before and the fact that we do have an existing climate action plan to draw upon. A year after we turn in the Priority Climate Action Plan, or the PCAP, we'll be asked to submit the Comprehensive Climate Action Plan, or the CCAP. And that's the plan that's going to include things like the carbon sinks accounting and the green jobs goals for the region. And obviously, that's going to involve a much more extensive planning process. So one of the things we'd really like to do is get through the PCAP as efficiently as possible so we can get a jump start on planning the CCAP. Simultaneously with developing the CCAP, once the PCAP is developed, we'll be able to start applying for some of those federal implementation dollars. So as we're identifying those projects, we want to also be thinking, what are the key ones we really want to ask for funding for right away? Once we get both of those submitted to the feds, that'll be great. We'll have basically a one-year period where we can see how things are rolling out, and then we'll have to develop a report to talk about how much progress we've made on these goals since the development of the PCAP. And that's the part of this process we know the least about, because it hasn't really been, there just hasn't been information put together. Like so much under the Inflation Reduction Act, they're moving very quickly. They're developing programs that have never existed before. There's been far more collaboration with the participating entities than I've ever seen from a federal programming before, which, as we know from our own engagement efforts, right, is both difficult to do but really important. And so I just want to tip my hat to all the faceless federal employees who've been working so hard to really get the Inflation Reduction Act programs up and running. They've had a tall task ahead of them. So that's far more information than you had in the memo, but we wanted to really give you a broad overview, as this project we anticipate is really going to occupy a lot of our efforts for the next 4 years. And we'll be tapping into you and your knowledge and expertise to help us shape that as we move forward. Are there any questions at this time? Yes, John.
I've got about 3 comments. First, I'm absolutely shocked that our governor would turn down $3 million for climate action. That's amazing. Number two, I am so grateful to you and whoever else had their antenna up and were aware of this. I'd love to know the backstory on this. Who went, oh, by the way, I just saw this, and what can we do? Somebody did, and thank you to that person or that team. And the last question, what are your deadlines for the initial climate action plans, the priority plan, the PCAP, the CCAP, et cetera, et cetera?
We just know rough ones right now. It's April 2023 for the PCAP and probably April 2024 for the CCAP.
I mean, 2024 and 25.
Yes, thank you. 24, 25, oh my God. So many programs, so many acronyms. When we get our more detailed feedback, when our work plan is accepted by the EPA and we're given the green light to go forward, we'll have more detailed dates to be able to offer you. And we'll keep you apprised as we move through that. We'll be giving regular updates essentially from this point going forward.
My applause to whoever figured this out, because this is way cool.
I did have a question. So one of the priorities, it sounds like, will be green jobs. Do we know what some of the other, and greenhouse gas emission reductions, but do we know if there are any other major priorities? So as we think about the programs and things that we might want to prioritize, those might float to the top, like number of people impacted, or I don't know what those other metrics might be.
Yeah. This is not going to come as a surprise. There's a Justice 40 component to it. So that's part of our thinking ahead and identifying those areas. There is a chart that I can bring that talks about what are the required elements for the PCAP and what are required for the CCAP. Why don't I put that on our actionable items for next month to include that in the packet so you can be thinking at. They're at once technical and kind of broad. I think a lot of this, we're just going to be feeling our way through. But yeah, that's an excellent question as we think ahead.
Do you think that you brought up the methane study, like maybe it's time to pull that back out? Do you think there are similar opportunities with the solar study, that there might be things from that study that would be worth readdressing?
I'd have to take a look at the solar study again. A lot of the solar study was about identifying regulatory barriers. In particular, there was an emphasis on community solar, and until we have net metering enabled by the state, we're a little limited in what we can do there. But there would be solar opportunities broadly, maybe not tied to that specific study, but other initiatives we have. We're already tapping into federal dollars under the Inflation Reduction Act as we look to put solar panels out at the airport. And one of the things that we've been discussing internally flowing from the 24/7 discussions last year is what it would take to get all of city operations to 100% renewable energy. We've been sort of quietly laying some groundwork there to think how we might approach that. And so that might be something we could pull forward. In particular, looking at something like, and actually this feels like all things lead to wastewater, but they're a huge energy user for the city. Looking at the possibility of putting solar panels out at the wastewater treatment plant might be a great thing to include in this plan.
Did you see the movie Nuclear that I talked about by any chance?
No.
And the reason I bring it up, I'll restate, and I'll have my facts wrong, that we can only go so far with renewables. That somewhere along the way, somebody's going to have to start re-lobbying for nuclear. Not everyone in the room may believe that, but I certainly do after seeing that movie. And it's not either or. I think it's a both and. Long term, we need to be lobbying for the tough stuff while we're working. Not that renewables are easy, but they're relatively easier and more attainable right now than nuclear. But unfortunately, again, we're back to politics, and we're back to the fossil fuel industry who doesn't want to talk about that until they get every ounce of their money out of the ground, and then and only then will they be willing to talk about it. So anytime we get extra funds, I'd love to see just a teeny bit, a paragraph being spent somewhere, talking to the right people about other options that we're going to long-term need. Because we set world records the last week, highest temperature in the world, highest mean temperature in the world one day and then higher the next day. And I don't know if anyone's listening. I know this group is preaching to the choir here. But oh my God, I'm afraid no one's going to listen until after the 24 elections. And then after the next elections, and then after the next elections. And the biggest thing we can do and our counterparts around the country is to be that grinding chalk on the blackboard voice that just won't let people forget that we can't wait. Again, I'm preaching to the choir.
No, much appreciated and noted.
Remind me, are adaptation measures part of the opportunities as well?
I believe they'd be worth putting in as well. The other thing that's so nice about this timing is our accelerated action plan really goes through items that we want to implement in 2025, at which point our own plan would really be due for thinking about what works, what doesn't, how do we update the plan for the future. So what this essentially is doing is it's going to allow us to substitute a regional plan for that effort and to take everything we've learned so far and what we've been able to implement and what we haven't, and bring it forward. And so because it's going to stand in for a new climate action plan for the city, there's no reason why we shouldn't include adaptation. Even if it doesn't get federal funding, it's still worth articulating those goals in the plan. And I doubt Cedar Rapids would disagree.
You mentioned, the other communities in the metropolitan area. Have you had any initial conversations with others, like in Washington County or?
I myself have not had them necessarily in Washington County. We have been engaging through the Sustainability Working Group of Johnson County with some of our neighboring communities that way, and I know that ECOG has been notifying their members of the opportunity and communicating with them. So word is trickling out. We have a little bit, we'd like to have a little more robust guidance from the EPA to know how we're going to move forward so that it's not a get excited and wait scenario, particularly for these communities that haven't been engaged with climate action planning in the past. But we are hearing some, I would say, nice indicators of interest from our neighboring communities in participating, which is good.
This is Sturdivant. Can you? So is the fund? I'm probably really confused on this, but so the $1 million, and then what we do with that is tied to future funding, like through the grants and things. Like, do they have to see what we do, or can you run it by me again? Like the $1 million tied to future funding.
Yeah, of course. It is confusing. So it's $1 million, which is a lot of money and sounds like a lot of money. If you consider that $1 million is supposed to be spread over 4 years, that's $250,000 per year for planning activities, some of which is quite technical. So we will be able to spend it and handily. It is strictly for planning activities. We can't do implementation, so we can't buy a solar panel with this funding, but we can develop a plan saying, here's where we'd like solar panels to go, or this is how many solar panels we think would meet this need in the community. And then using that plan, we can then apply for competitive grants under the same program, which is a much, much larger pot of money The difference being, we just had to put our hand up and say, yes, we would like this money, please and thank you, for the planning grants. For the competitive grants, we'll have to make a case as to why we should get this money and a different community or a different region should not. And that's where having a plan is both helpful, but also just brass tacks a requirement to apply for those funds. As I often like to point out, the federal government rarely says, here's a bunch of money, go have fun, kids, right? They want to see that you have a plan for how it's going to be used, that you've accounted for things like environmental impact and equitable impact. And so essentially, they're doing exactly what we're doing with our Resilience Hub pilot, in that they're giving us a year to formulate those plans and then decide what we'd really like to go for in terms of our funding requests. Does that help, Gabe?
Yeah, that helps a lot. I mean, I know there's a lot of, red tape, but it sounded like, hey, you got a bunch of holes to jump through to do this, but I wanted to double check on that. So thank you.
And if you're confused, that's sort of par for the course right now. It's a new program, it's not existed before, so we can't look at the way it was done in the past. And I can say I went through roughly a half dozen webinars and convenings of sustainability leaders before I really had my arms around it. So I think it's just going to be a learning curve for all of us, but that there's no reason to wait and see. We may as well go for it while we're learning. It truly is, I think, a once-in-a-generation opportunity.
Yeah, it sounds like it. And thanks for staying on top of that, because, I can't imagine sifting through some of that paperwork.
All right, well, barring any other questions, we look forward to keeping you updated on this process, and hopefully before long, we'll get everyone engaged in working on the PCAP, which is exciting.
All right, and that takes us into a recap and confirmation of the next meeting time, which I could do, which is scheduled for Monday, August 7th at 3:30 here.
And for actionable items, I'm going to include the table of PCAP and CCAP requirements in the next agenda packet. Am I missing anything else? All right.
You said we can't buy solar panels. Can we buy a nuclear reactor?
What are you going to do with all that waste, John?
I guess that's a no.
I don't know that you want $1 million nuclear reactor.
I just want to say we're going to debate this first, right, before we start putting nuclear reactors on any action plans. I want a larger discussion.
A robust debate, yes.
And we're not the final word either. For the CCAP especially, we're going to have a lot of community engagement. So lest you think the climate future of the entire community rests on your shoulders alone, we're really looking for your help in shaping the conversation that we're going to have more broadly with the community as a whole.
Okay, if there's nothing else, I will gladly accept a motion to adjourn.
Krieger, I motion to adjourn.
Solman, second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
We'll see you August 7th.